£3 of sprouts, 1 antelope carcass, 2 turtle doves, and an anchovy. My God, Mrs. Beeton, you've gone too far this time. Oh, hello, dears. My name is Mrs. Agatha Wylder, but you can call me Mrs. Agatha. In fact, you can call me whatever you like, as long as it's not Aggie, since that's what my father called me after he returned from the Crimean War at the end of 1856. You see, he couldn't remember my full name after he was hit on the head by a Russian cavalryman during the charge of the Light Brigade, and frankly, he was never the same again. Now, let me pour myself a cup of tea before we start. I have some wonderful tea bags here today. Traditional English tea. We're going to open it up like so and take out a tea bag. Pop it in the pot. And give it a wiggle. And now let's pour out the tea. There we go. Take a sip. Delightful. Why am I here today? You may or may not be asking. Well, I am the great-great-great-grandmother of dear Kate of the Library of Whispers, and I'm here to do a little Victorian etiquette instruction for all you ladies and gentlemen. You may also be wondering why I'm speaking so quietly. Well, I think it's a little odd too, but I believe it's something you all like. But primarily, I'm doing it because my husband Victor is currently asleep on the dining room table next door. He's been at the boards again, and I'd rather not wake him, since he's like a bear with a sore head unless he gets his full 13 hours. In fact, our new maid of all work, Dotty, or is it Lottie? Anyway, she managed to disturb him by mistake the other day, after he'd only had 11.5 hours. And as you can imagine, there was all hell to pay. She told me she was only trying to rescue the cat after he got stuck up the chimney in the kitchen, and instead of pulling him down, she shoved him further up, and he came out with a whoosh in the main bedroom, completely covered in soot, and landed on poor Victor's head. He wasn't pleased, and neither was Victor. Let's have a bit more tea. But I'm deviating again from my main purpose for being here on what I believe is called YouTube. To be honest, the last time I was on the tube, I took a trip on the Underground Railway from Baker Street to King's Cross Station. But this feels a little different than that, not quite as enclosed. Anyway, I am here to instruct you in the art of, amongst other things, polite conversation. Actually, Victor calls my deviations from the point rambling, whereas I like to think of it as departing gently from the main topic of conversation, like leaving the railway station and realising you're on the wrong train, that you're heading for Barnstaple rather than Macclesfield, if you see what I mean. However, a good friend of mine, Mrs Florence Hartley, published a wonderful manual of politeness for ladies a number of years ago, and I'd like to use it today as a way of instructing you all in the ways and means of behaving in polite society, or frankly, any kind of society, which calls for more tea. So let's begin. Mrs Hartley says that the art of conversation consists in the exercise of two fine qualities. You must originate and you must sympathise. You must possess at the same time the habit of communicating and of listening attentively. None but an excessively ill-bred person will allow his or her attention to wander from the person with whom she or he is conversing, and especially she or he will never, while seeming to be entirely attentive to their companion, answer a remark or question made to another person in another group. Fine advice, I believe. Unless, of course, you're speaking to Mrs Rumbold of 27 Acacia Avenue, Croydon, since, and do keep this to yourselves, but Mrs Rumbold is the dullest woman I've ever had the misfortune to spend an afternoon with. It is simply impossible to keep your attention on this woman's conversation. I am ashamed to say that I found myself nodding off after the third mention of her son Archibald's new dentures, which apparently are made of wood and make a clicking sound every time he speaks. I have to tell you that I was desperate to get away from 27 Acacia Avenue and Mrs Rumbold's company, but thankfully I was literally saved by the bell. When Mrs Bell from 4 Marigold Way came to visit unannounced, and I was able to escape from the clutches of Mrs Rumbold and her son's clattering teeth. Now, Mrs Hartley also advises the following. Be careful in conversation to avoid topics which may be supposed to have any direct reference to events or circumstances which may be painful for your companion to hear discussed. You may unintentionally start a subject which annoys or troubles the friend with whom you may be conversing. Now that is very true. It was only last week when I was engaged in conversation on my back doorstep with Mr Rissoul, the baker, who had arrived with our weekly bread delivery. I was chatting politely and attentively with him, as Mrs Hartley recommends, and I was telling him about the latest scandal in the area. Apparently, a local man had recently been discovered selling ice cream cornets in Regent's Park, laced with laudanum, and very popular they were too. Well, by the time the bobbies from Bow Street caught up with him, he was sleeping soundly in the Elephant House at London Zoo. Apparently, he'd eaten too much of his own ice cream and nodded off. The problem was, of course, and how was I to know, that it was actually Mr Rissoul's Uncle Ralph who was the culprit. As you can imagine, I was very embarrassed, as was Mr Rissoul. However, I continued to adhere to Mrs Hartley's advice, which is, do not stop abruptly when you perceive that your mistaken conversation causes pain, and above all, do not make the matter worse by apologising. Turn to another subject as soon as possible, and pay no attention to the agitation your unfortunate remark may have excited upon the poor friend or acquaintance. So I did that very thing as soon as I noticed Mr Rissoul, going a peculiar shade of puce I expediently changed the subject and appraised him of the benefits he would immediately see if he sprinkled elephant dung on Mrs Rissole's hydrangeas. As you can imagine, he was very grateful for the advice and said he'd give it some thought. A little more tea, I think. Now, Mrs Hartley also advises not to hog all the attention to yourself when speaking to a person. Remember that having all the talk sustained by one person is not conversation. Do not engross all the attention yourself by refusing to allow another person an opportunity to speak. Indeed, this reminds me of when I literally bumped into Mrs Rissole 2 weeks after the incident with her husband on my back doorstep. I was just leaving Hatchard's, you know, the bookshop in Piccadilly, when Mrs Rissole appeared as if from nowhere. Gave me quite a start, I can tell you. I dropped all 3 of the books I'd just purchased, including the latest edition of Mrs Beeton's book of household management. Well, Mrs Rissole couldn't stop gabbing. On and on and on she went, all about how she'd managed to obtain some elephant dung from London Zoo, and how it had done her hydrangeas no end of good. Frankly, I couldn't get a word in edgeways. Mrs Hartley would have been aghast at Mrs Rissole's lack of good grace, and not once did she thank me for the advice. And the cover of Mrs Beeton's poor book was destroyed beyond repair, since it had been raining extremely heavily only moments before my encounter with Mrs Rissole, and the book had plopped straight into a puddle. More tea. Anyway, I think I can hear Victor stirring in the dining room. I do hope that Mrs Hartley's excellent advice on polite conversation will serve you well. I'll hand back over to dear Kate for a little more 21st century MRSA. Oh no, I think that might be a kind of bacteria. Anyway, however the letters are actually arranged, I do hope to see you again. Goodbye, dears. Goodbye.